Here's a brief introduction of vendor finance for a business sale / acquisition. Firstly, I'm going to explain what vendor finance is. Then we'll go into the pros and cons of vendor finance and why it's important for accountants to be knowledgeable on this topic also, and the different way to actually look at vendor finance. So vendor finance is where a proportion of the sale price is loaned out or financed by the seller. It's actually used quite significantly in places like the USA and Europe. In America, it's close to over 60% of deals have a proportion of vendor finance, where in Australia it would be like less than 10% of business sales are using vendor finance. However, that said, during the COVID lockdown, that proportion has actually grown, and there's been more of a use of vendor finance here in Australia. Now, an example of vendor finance, let's say, is you did $1 million worth of sale of your business, and you would get probably $800,000 of that upfront and $200,000 over a period of time, 6 months to 3 years, depending. And quite often that finance component, that vendor finance, does come with some conditions of performance. And if done correctly, it also should come with some reward in regard to an interest payment attached to it too. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to use a very, very scientific tool to give you a graphic demonstration of how vendor finance works. Okay, so here is my scientific tool to demonstrate how vendor finance might work in the sale of a business. So you've sold your business, and this is the sale price of the business. However, you're not going to keep it all because the government would want some of that, and you'd be paying a fair proportion in tax no matter what country you're in. But this would be your take-home amount for the years you've spent in your particular business. Now, how vendor finance might work in the equation is something like this. Firstly, you should actually make a higher price if you use vendor finance appropriately. So let's just rise up the total sale price of your business. But you're not going to make that all at once. What we do is we stagger it over a period of time. That might be 1, 2, or 3 years. And you might get that, you'll get that component up front, then you'll get another component 1 year, and then another component the year after. You still will be paying tax, absolutely, you can't get away from that, but hopefully it should be reduced. So that goes to the tax man, that's what you make up front, and that's the year after and the year after that. So overall, you're actually earning more because you've increased the price of the sale of the business, and you're using some tax effective strategies. So the pros of vendor finance is that you should actually, if used effectively, you should get a higher price of your sale of your business. And it also should be a faster sale, and because you're bringing on potentially more buyers into the mix of selling your business. The cons are that the finance component is at risk. There are some times, well, actually a fair amount of times, where the seller won't actually get all of their vendor finance back, and in some cases not get it back at all. But there are some measures that you can take to reduce that risk, but it definitely is at risk. Okay, let's use some figures to dig down and get an explanation of vendor finance. And firstly, let me explain, again, I'm not an accountant, this is not financial advice. Purely these figures are to demonstrate a formula and a principle only. Okay, the business that was sold for $1 million or 1,000K, and the government's going to take a slice of that, and let's just assume it's $200,000. And by the way, this is where we need input and a bit of assistance or interaction, liaison between the accountant, the customer's accountant, and your business broker. Because if you know that, you can future plan some things. Anyway, 1,000K business sold for $200,000 in tax, which left the business owner in their pocket with $800,000. Now let's look at that if we used vendor finance. So, like I said, you should actually, if you use vendor finance, you should get a higher price. So conservatively, let's just say that we made an extra $50,000 on that sale because we used effectively vendor finance to market that business. And so the sale price was $1,050K. Now, and we split it up between a finance component of $250 and an upfront of $800,000. Now, because the 800 is lower than the 1,000, the tax would be less. You'd still be paying tax, but there would be less. Let's just assume that it's $150K that goes to the tax man, and you've vendor finance $250K. So all up, using this strategy, then the owner would actually be putting in their pocket $900,000, an additional $100,000, as opposed to not using vendor finance. Now, yes, up front, their figure would be less. They'd be making $650K, and they'd be financing the rest $250 over a period of time. But overall, they'd be making a significant amount of more money. That basically is how vendor finance works. I want to address the negativity around vendor finance because a lot of business owners just totally balk at the prospect of vendor finance, just are totally not interested in it. And I understand that feeling because a significant amount of business owners have been burnt with vendor finance, as I've said previously, either not getting it all or not getting it parts of it. But it's quite often the case because they've gone into vendor finance as an afterthought and not a strategy. And what I'd suggest is that salespeople, business brokers, and the accountants think of it more as a tool to use in the sale of your business. And what I mean by this is, what if the seller of the business broker, and the accountant all liaise together to work out what this number would be on a rough sale of the business? And then once the accountant was able to determine what that figure is, then the business broker could take into their negotiations of the sale of the business, understanding that they could effectively use some component of that, as they're going to lose it anyway to the tax man. So, well, why don't we use it as a bargaining tool to get a higher price up here, and do that at the forefront of the negotiations as opposed to the back end. And if it's dealt with more effectively, professionally, with the three working together and put some protections in place, then your outcome should be significantly better. Anyway, I hope this information helps. I'm going to drop into the comments at least one other link to a third party that I reference and I hold in quite high regard in regard to explaining things like vendor finance it digs a lot more deeper than my very quick explanation. Thank you and have a great day.